Right, well, I'm back again for another update on what I have been reading. As you'll have seen the title of this video, you'll know that this is what I read in May and June of 2023. And the reason these two are combined is because I went into a real reading slump halfway through, towards the end of May, that lasted most of June. So I'll talk about that when I get to it in the sort of order of books that I've read. So let's get going. The first book that I read in, I'm going to have to keep remembering what month I'm talking about, May, was Harvest by Jim Grace. I mentioned in my previous video we'd been to see a show called 3 Acres and a Cow, which talked about land rights and how the land rights that the ordinary British people had prior to the Norman invasion in 1066 were very different to what we had just a few hundred years later. And how systematically the land has been taken away from ordinary people and given to very, very few. And that came with a reading list. And the book I read last month of that reading list was probably one of my favourite books of all time. It was absolutely brilliant. But this was another one, Jim Grace Harvest. Very similar, as in, as late summer steals in and the final pearls of barley are gleamed, a village comes under threat. A trio of outsiders, two men and a dangerously magnetic woman arrive on the woodland borders, triggering a series of events that will see Walter Thirsk's village unmade in just 7 days. The harvest blackened by smoke and fear, cruel punishment meted out to the innocent, and allegations of witchcraft. But something even darker is at the heart of Walter's story, and he will be the only man left to tell it. So this was a story of, it was a medieval village that had a lord. Can't remember when it was set, but it was probably late medieval times. Around the time that the enclosures were just starting to happen, and what happened in this village when it went really badly wrong, and it was quite gory, gruesome. It was good. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't as good as the other one I read, Elmet, last time, but it was a good book, and I did enjoy it. Very, very interesting and quite thought-provoking at times as well. What was that one? Then the next two books were the two books that I got in the May book club from my daughters and grandchildren, who bought me a book a month to read throughout the year. So these books were chosen by my grandchildren for me. And the first one was Dewey, Small Town Library Cat Who Touched the World. This was about a librarian and her staff who found a cat in a dumpster in America, and they brought it in and it became the library cat. And it was a very small library in a very small town, and this cat became quite famous in America, and people used to come from all over America to meet Dewey the cat. It was quite sweet. It was quite sweet. The writing was very simple. It was a very simplistic book. It brought up how animals can help people in various levels of distress, and how it can take something very small to bring a community together to support each other. So it was very good. It was written by Vicky Maron, who was the head librarian at the time, and she gave a good story. Obviously, the cat it was written in. Let me just check the date. The date was published in 2008, but I think it was actually written in 1988. But anyway, by this time, Dewey obviously was no longer around. But he's still remembered very fondly in that small village. I'd never heard of the story before, but it was nice. It was very sweet, very friendly, a nice little book to read. That was the one that my granddaughter Willow chose for me. Harrison chose it for me. The Urban Dog, The Adventures of Parker by Will Cohu. Not sure how to say that. This was very similar. This guy was a journalist who got a little black Scotty dog called Parker, and it was kind of really an autobiography about him, and what he did with his life and the things that happened with Parker while they went through it. So these two books were in many ways very, very similar. This one was based in London, and in the sort of West London, a lot around the Notting Hill kind of Portobello Road area, which is an area that I know very well. And so it was quite nice to be reading about that area and about the places that I know, and recognising some of the caricatures that were kind of in there. Dewey was set in a small town in America, so not quite as relatable for me. However, this was written by a journalist, guy who was very impressed with himself, and there was a little bit of that tone of "look at me, aren't I so clever and wonderful" all the way through it. It wasn't. I don't think he was such a nice character as the lady who wrote Dewey. So there were different things I liked about them both. One I could relate to a little bit more with the dog, but I didn't actually like the writer as much as I liked the writer in the other one. So, but they were both very, very fun books, very, very light. I think I read each of them in an evening. It was, and they were okay. They were good. After that, I went on to read the collection of Robin of Sherwood. Um, these weren't just written by Robin of Sherwood. These were written by Richard Carpenter, Jennifer Ash, Elliot Thorpe, and Kenton Hall. Some people may remember Robin of Sherwood, a TV show from the 80s. It is, in my opinion, the greatest TV show ever made. And ran for 3 seasons, and they were planning on a 4th season, but it never got made. So some of the stories that are in this book are stories that were going to be episodes in season 4. There was also talk about making a film, just one film follow-up afterwards, which again, the story that was going to be in that film is in here. None of that ever happened, and it's still going. Really enjoyed it. The writing really captured the characters as they were in the actual season. You could really see who they all were and why they were working. I'm counting this as one book, but it is actually about 5 different books that have been combined into one. But very good, very nice, and it was nice to get another kick of Robin of Sherwood and some new stories and some new things to think about with them. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I read it quite quickly, and it was a real pleasure for me. Not sure people who aren't so obsessed with Robin of Sherwood would want to read it, but for someone like myself who is, it was a really good book to read. Then I read The Last Woman in the World. This was a book from the End of the World Reading Club. By Inga Simpson, and it's night and the walls of Rachel's home creak in the darkness of the Australian bush. Her fear of other people has led her to a reclusive life, as far from them as possible, her only occasional contact with her sister. A hammering on the door, there stand her mother Hannah and her sick baby. They are running for their lives from a mysterious death sweeping the Australian countryside and something that is hunted. So yeah, I remember this. This was quite good actually. It was a lady who'd very much isolated herself from the world. I didn't really give a reason why, if I can remember rightly. And then suddenly when the apocalypse happened, she actually took her a while to realise. And this woman and her child came and she had to help them to save them. It was good. I enjoyed it. I think the bit at the beginning, I think I enjoyed the most, but I think it was quite a realistic portrayal of what the world would be like at the end. Yeah, it was a good book. It was a good read. If you're into apocalyptic books, then this is a good one. Not too difficult, not too challenging, and I think most people would probably quite enjoy it. So that was The Last Woman in the World. And then I started to read The Forcing. Frustrated and angry after years of denial and inaction in a last-ditch attempt to stave off disaster, a government of youth has taken power in North America and a policy of institutionalized ageism has been introduced. All those older than the prescribed age are deemed responsible for the current state of the world and are to be relocated, their property and assets confiscated. I started to read this. I got as far as about page 15 and I went into a real reading slump. This was a book, I believe, from the End of the World Reading Club. I don't think there's anything wrong with the book. I just stopped wanting to read. And that is very unusual for me. I don't often have reading slumps, but I think everybody does. And it's one of those, if it's something you love, every so often you'll just need a quick break from it. I started to watch a lot more television, which I don't normally watch. I had a few things on my mind in relation to work. And a couple of things that happened in the family, and some positive. My daughter got married, some negative. One daughter had a house fire, then they had a car crash. It was just a period of time where I was struggling to focus. I think this book is not going to go in the bin as a book I can't read. It's going to go back onto my to be read TBR pile, and I will return to it in the future when I am in more of a reading mood. How to get out of a reading slump? Sometimes it's go back to the books you know. I've often gone back to Harry Potter. I will probably do a video on Harry Potter at some point, and why I still read it and why I still love it so much. But go back to the books you know, or sometimes it's try something completely different. I would always suggest going for simple books. Don't try reading a great big tome of a classic at that point when you're in a reading slump. Go for a very easy sort of popcorn kind of book and try and get back into it. But don't worry about it. Your love of reading will return. It will come back. Um, so yeah, just go with it. So this I started at the end of May, and I didn't get anywhere with it. And it was kind of this book I was still reading at the beginning of June, and I'd still only got to page 15. So I didn't really get very far with it. And you'll see from what I read in June is very, very light in comparison to all the other months that I've read. So here we go. The next two were the two books from the June books from the reading club that my daughters did for me. And these are both on a theme. One is King Arthur's Bones, Glastonbury Abbey, 1191. During excavation work, an ancient laden cross is discovered buried several feet below ground. Inscribed upon it are the words Hic Tacit Sepulchus Inclius Rex Arturus. That's my Latin. Really good, eh? Really good Latin. Here lies buried the renowned King Arthur. Beneath the cross, the skeletal remains. Could this really be the legendary King Arthur and his queen Guinevere? This was lovely. This was a lovely little book. It was. It took me a while to read it because of my reading slump. Normally, it's a book I would have hammered out in a couple of days. Basically, it was four, I think it was, different stories of these bones and how they were sort of discovered or fought over a period of time, with the final little epilogue being them finding them again in the modern world. Never were too sure whether these ever were King Arthur's bones. I don't think anybody could ever know. But it was a nice story and a nice premise, and all the little stories were little mysteries that were quite short. So I think this was very good for me in a reading slump because I didn't have to focus too much. I didn't even have to remember all the names. It was a lovely little book. I think there's more of these medieval murderers. They were written by, I think they were written by different people actually. Yeah. Michael Jex, Susanna Gregory, Bernard Knight, Ian Mawson and Philip Godden, they each wrote one of the little stories in the book, and I think they've done some others like that as well. 5 compelling mysteries. Yeah, I think there might be more than this one in the series. Yes, there are. The House of Shadows, The Lost Prophecies. Yeah, will I go out and buy them? Probably not. If I saw them, would I buy them? Probably. Saw them in a second-hand shop, would I buy them? Yeah, I would. And I would read them again. Yeah, a lovely, sweet little book, quite a good little book for a holiday, or when you've got something going on that you need to do and you just want to read and go and do something. Read and go and do something. Quite a good little books for those. Yeah, I enjoyed them. That was really good. The next book was another one of that. Was up with that, called The Stonemason: A History of Building Britain. I love history books, and I love it. Slightly different takes on it, and this was this. In his 30-year career, Andrew Ziminski has worked on many of our greatest monuments, from Neolithic monoliths to Roman rebaths and temples, from the Tower of Salisbury Cathedral to the engine houses, mills and aqueducts of the Industrial Revolution and beyond. The Stonemason is his very personal story of how Britain was built from the inside out. So basically, he talks about a job that he's doing, and then tells the history of the time through that sort of work that he's doing. So it's very interesting. I didn't learn very much about history. I learned way more than I ever want to know about stonemasonry. And I think that's the biggest criticism of the book. It was just a bit too technical at times, and I found I was skipping over those bits to get to the bits that he wanted to talk about. He seemed to be doing it in a boat as well, a kayak down the Thames, which was quite interesting considering the next book I read. But yeah, it was interesting. It was interesting. I will probably go back and read it again at some point. There were a lot of places that he mentioned in there, and places and buildings and villages and things he mentioned in here that are not necessarily known as touristy places that I want to go to. So I think I should probably pop it away for a couple of years and come back to it one spring while I'm thinking about trips that I want to make in the summer. And I may build a summer's travelling around this book in future. So as you can tell, it wasn't an awful book, just a little bit too much technical stuff about putting one brick on top of another. that I wasn't very interesting, but it was good. I did enjoy it. Yeah, and I will use it again. And funny thing about it being about people in a boat down the Thames was the final book I read in June was Three Men in a Boat, classic adventure by Jerome J. Carome. Very classic book of three men and a dog in a boat on the Thames, going up from somewhere west of London to Oxford. It is a classic. This was the book out of the seasonal book suggestions that you read as you go through the year. I really enjoyed this far more than I thought I would. It was published in 1880. It is a bit classist. It is definitely sexist. There was one sort of point of racism, but nothing much. But I think for a book written in 1880, even the racism and the classism was, the sexism and the classism was quite tame compared to what you got in a lot of other books. But it was hilarious, and there were some very, very relatable bits in there that were really fun to read. There was a whole one about tow ropes on boats and how they all get tangled. And if you just transferred the words tow ropes and put it down as Christmas fairy lights, oh my God, it would be hilarious. You'd just laugh your socks off at it. There was a description of getting a new dog that was just brilliant. And there was some of those were the little sort of like descriptions of how he did it that were just so great. Again, it's not a very big book. And although there is one story of the four or three of them going up the river, there's no real narrative to it bar that. So that again, it's a good book to pick up and put down. As all you need to do is remember that they're going up the river, and that's all there is to it. A little bit of some of the reflections, particularly towards the end of the book, got a bit monotonous, but on the whole, I thought this was a really good book, and it really did deserve its status as a classic, as I think that it was so interesting how these descriptions of life at that point in time could be related back to life now so easily. It was really funny. So yeah, that was the final book I read in June. So as I say, I read 3 books in June, which is very different to the number of books I've been reading before. But I do feel like I've got my mojo back a little bit for reading now, and it'll be interesting to see what I read during July. So I will see you then. Goodbye.